Eee, good morning. I finally caught another stream. Oh hi. Ahaha, you made it. It's pretty hard to all be together. Yeah. How are you, Shiro? How? I'm doing okay. My weekend wasn't great, but I'm going on vacation soon. How are you guys? Drawing last page of Annabelle for the month. Nice. Just went out from hospital 2 days ago, but I'm okay now. I'm drawing for fun 2 of my OC. Oh, though you want to screen tone my work. Or, finish that contest piece. Which piece the con one? Yeah. I'm sorry you had to go to the hospital. Nah, it's okay. I could try toning. Whatever you have. But I'm sure it won't be up to your standards. I don't have the con file on this PC. Sure. Okie dokie.
Also, it's probably
to be accompanied in the short term by rapid change of violence. That said, it's certainly the case that there's other things that matter, and government controls are one. I think strong governments that monopolize the legitimate use of violence can keep a lid on violence for a long time. I would question whether they can keep a lid on it indefinitely, but they could keep a lid on it for a long time. If you execute all charged murderers, I presume that would keep the incidence of murder down, and not only because those people couldn't be recidivists.
right. So there's an element potentially of authoritarian control.
Yeah,
and then the other
I
element
think so.
that I think is particularly interesting is the time lag argument. I mean, you don't know over what period of time precisely inequality has its pernicious effects, and maybe it's not even the span of one lifetime. I mean, do you have any data on that would help answer the question?
Well, I did make reference in my book, Killing the Competition, to one sociological study that was looking at effects of inequality on mortality generally. And the notion that inequality affects mortality generally is mediated by what you were talking about health effects. The idea that stresses and fraught social comparisons produce greater vulnerability to stress-related diseases, and in fact, many diseases, most diseases maybe even, are stress-related in their ultimate impacts on people. So there's this one sociological study by a guy named Zheng in Ohio State, which sought effects of economic inequality on mortality in general, and came to the conclusion that the effects were lagged, that the maximum impact on current mortality was inequality 7 years ago, which sounds kind of funny, but he had analyses which seemed to show, and I'm a bit wary about the legitimacy of these analyses, but they seem to show to him that inequality of a few years ago affects the chance that you'll die now, net of the effects of age and sex and other predictors of mortality, and that there's sort of the cumulative consequences of many years of past inequality. So 7 years ago was the worst, but 6 and 8 also mattered additively. 5 years ago and 9 years ago also mattered additively. 10 years ago also mattered. So that how bad the inequality was in your past seems to affect your likelihood of dying now. The effects of violence haven't been looked at. It's hard to figure out how you could get a decent enough data set to do that right. But I don't think it's impossible.
Okay, so with regards to health effects, so I'm going to lay out an account of them, and you can tell me what you think about this. All right, so your brain is always trying to calculate to some degree how good things are going for you, and that's an extraordinarily difficult calculation because life is uncertain and ultimately uncertain, and it's difficult to predict the future except perhaps by using the past as a marker. And so what seems to happen is that our nervous systems are always interested in how prepared we should be for emergency at any given moment. And as far as I can tell, there are a number of ways that we calibrate that. One is baseline levels of trait neuroticism. So that's sensitivity to anxiety and uncertainty and emotional pain. And so you seem to be born, roughly speaking, at your average level of neuroticism, which can vary substantially between people. It can be also adjusted at puberty, and then the environment can move you in one direction or another. So, for example, if you have a highly anxious child and you encourage them to go out and explore, then you can move them towards the normal range. Jerry Kagan has demonstrated that quite nicely. Okay, so the first estimate of how worried you should be about the future is like genetic roll of the dice. Some people will be born extraordinarily worried, roughly speaking, and some people will be born hardly worried at all, and then that can be modified by the particulars of the social environment.
Right.
So then the next thing that seems to me to be part of the calculation is comparison. How well are you doing compared to others?
Yeah.
And that seems to be adjusted by mechanisms that associate perceived social status with serotonergic activity, such
Okay.
that as you move up a dominance hierarchy, your serotonin levels rise, so that your impulsivity, which would be partly sensitivity to immediate reward, declines, and so does your sensitivity to negative emotion. Whereas if you plummet down to the bottom of a hierarchy, you start to become more reward seeking and also more anxious. And the reason for that, more anxious, is because the bottom of the dominance hierarchy actually is a more dangerous place to be, because you don't have reliable access, as reliable, to shelter or food or mating resources or health care. And you even see this in birds, so if a flu sweeps through an avian population, it's the bedraggled birds at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy that die first. And so then one more thing, and then I tell me what you think about this, is that the other thing that seems to happen is that as you plummet down the dominance hierarchy and your mind settles into a more depressed and anxious state, the levels of cortisol that you produce chronically rise. And cortisol is a good hormone for activating you, but in high doses, high continual doses, it starts to produce brain damage, particularly in the hippocampus. And it also suppresses immunological function, which makes you more susceptible to infectious diseases. So that seems to be approximately the process. And so it's no wonder that people are trying to flee away from the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. Does that seem reasonable?
Yes, give me a moment. I've got to cough and blow my nose.
Okay.
Hay fever season in southern Ontario.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I wish I were a better behavioral endocrinologist and knew a bit more, was more expert in some of the processes that you're talking about. But a lot of that makes sense to me. This fraught social comparisons, I mean, the evidence certainly is that it's more stressful to be low ranking than high ranking. We've had a little myth that, being a very high rank puts all this burden of decision making on you, and that's terribly stressful and makes you vulnerable to heart attack and blah, blah, blah. And the data say the opposite. The data say that's not true. The more power and status and, if you like, decision making authority you have, the less vulnerable you seem to be to stress-related diseases. So, a lot of what you're saying makes evident sense to me. Then the developmental story that you're telling, I mean, I think it's right that people. I don't know how important the throw of the genetic dice is. I think it's an extremely interesting puzzle evolutionarily, why there's as much heritable genetic variability in seemingly important domains as there is. And I'm not convinced anybody has, really understands what modulates how much variability there is. But in any case, that things are adjustable in response to what you encounter and in response to social status, perceived social status, in response to social comparisons, makes evident sense to me. And again, I don't know enough about the putative damaging effects of excessively prolonged exposure to, say, high cortisol levels to be sure whether there isn't still some adaptation, some actual functionality to the response to long-term exposure lurking beneath the seeming breakdown of the system. Because it just seems to me that sort of a-Darwinian, non-evolutionary social scientists and psychiatrists and psychologists have been too quick to assume pathology when they see states of affairs that do indeed have damaging consequences, but may in some nevertheless have some utility. I wish I knew a little more about that.
Well, I think both the low serotonin and the high cortisol levels are interesting in that regard, because what does happen is the combination of those two things makes you A, more impulsive, and B, more prepared for emergency action. And both of those things are very useful in an uncertain environment. The detrimental consequences seem to occur as a consequence of prolonged overload, is that because your body is utilizing, imagine that what your body is doing is utilizing more units of resource per moment of time because of the necessity for preparation for unexpected events. and that can become physiologically exhausting in the long run. So I think it seems to me that those biochemical effects do underlie the sort of adaptive responses that you describe, except that too much is too much. And
Yeah.
if it's hard to live at the bottom, what that means is you age faster and you don't live as long, and you also have higher susceptibility to disease. And maybe in some sense that's the price you pay for the adaptive impulsivity that's also necessary to give you a chance to shoot back up the hierarchy, if that's the sort of thing that you're looking for.
Yeah, no, and I can't help thinking about sort of the evolutionary theories of senescence and bodily repair that were pioneered by Sir Peter Medawar back in the 50s and developed more by George Williams. The idea that many things involve some sort of trade-off between expenditure of energy, of accumulated resources, of capacity in the pursuit of something now at the expense of reduced capacity to be successful later. And so, one reason why these chronic states may have long-term damaging effects is because selection against being in these chronic states has not been strong, because those who are in them for a long time didn't historically tend to live very long anyway, and they're being, if you like, motivated or prepared to engage in high-risk activities that at least have some chance of short-term payoff, which is more or less what you said, actually.
Well, and you talked about this let's call it a misbegotten idea that there's stress at the top of the dominance hierarchy, just like there is stress at the bottom, and that the stress at the top is responsibility and decision making and all of that. And I do believe that there's truth in that, but there's another important biological element that needs to be considered. And so there's plenty of work done in the domains of clinical psychology, and some of this is psychophysiological and neurophysiological for that matter, showing that a stress of an equivalent magnitude has fewer negative effects if it's taken on voluntarily. So because what happens
Yes.
is that if you voluntarily engage in the stressful activity, your approach systems are activated rather than your defense systems. And the approach systems are associated with positive emotion whereas the negative emotions are associated with this defensive posturing that includes preparation for emergency, and that's much more physiologically damaging. And so whether you pick up a load voluntarily or have it thrust upon you seems to make a big difference to how heavy it is. And that's a very interesting piece of set of research studies. As far as I'm concerned, it's quite fascinating that can be the case.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you another question. Let's get down to, we might say, brass tacks here. So we can make a case that inequality destabilizes societies and cranks up the male-on-male homicide rate. And the destabilization occurs because young men become more and more unpredictable and violent. And so you could make a conservative case as well as a liberal case for not having a society that takes inequality to an extreme, because conservatives, at least in principle, should be concerned with the maintenance of social stability over the long run. So, okay, and so then you might make a case for income redistribution, but that gets very, very troublesome because it's not that easy to redistribute income, and that's what I want to talk to you about. So, we're in a situation, of course, where the top 1% of the population controls a substantial proportion of the economic resources, and the top 1% of that top 1% controls the bulk of that. Now, I've looked into that quite deeply, and that distribution it's not a normal distribution of money. It's a Pareto distribution of money. But the weird thing about Pareto distributions, and so that's a distribution where many people end up with zero, and just a few people end up with a lot, is that a Pareto distribution characterizes zero-sum games that are played out to their conclusion. So like Monopoly, everybody starts in the middle, but then random trading produces an eventual Pareto-shaped distribution where lots of people start to stack up on the loser side. One person accelerates towards victory until finally everyone's at zero except one person. So it's the logical outcome of random trading game. So that's the first thing that's interesting about the Pareto distribution. The second thing that's interesting is that Pareto distributions, Pareto distributions emerge in every domain of creative human production, not just the distribution of money. So for example, we did an analysis of creative achievement across the lifespan using
Right.
an instrument called the Creative Achievement Questionnaire. And so what it did was assess people's levels of competence across 13 potential domains of creative activity. And so we
Okay.
were looking at production rather than creative thinking per se, right?
Right.
Although those two things are related and quite tightly. We wanted to know who actually accomplished things in the world. And so for musical ability, for example, the 0 score would be I have no training or talent in this area, and the maximum score would be, you know, my original compositions have been played for international audiences. And so we've now administered that to hundreds of people, and the median score is 0 across all 13 domains. It's a very, very precise Pareto distribution, with a few people who are the outliers producing the overwhelming majority of the goods. And you also, and that there's also a law that De Sola Price came up with back in the 1960s governing the output of scientific papers. And he found that the square root of the number of people operating within an academic domain produced half the papers that were published in that domain.
Right.
So that's not so bad if there's 10 researchers, because then 3 of them are producing half the papers. But if there's 1,000 researchers operating in a domain, then 30 of them are producing half the papers. Okay, so and then one more complication, and then I'm going to let you have at this. So I've been looking for, now you can think that the Pareto distribution, which by the way characterizes the distribution of wealth in every known society, although the degree to which the distribution is skewed differs. You can say that the Pareto distribution is a consequence of the final playing out of a random trading game. But then here's the complication. This is something that's been, you know, bothering me for years. There are predictors of long-term life success in relatively stable societies. And the best predictors are in this order. The first predictor is IQ. The second predictor is trait conscientiousness, and it's about half as powerful as IQ. And the third predictor is low neuroticism, and it's about half as powerful as conscientiousness. So if you get a good measure of IQ and a good measure of conscientiousness, then you can predict about 25% of the variance in performance, especially across managerial, administrative, and academic domains. And then with regards to entrepreneurial performance, you can use IQ and trait openness, which is the creativity measure. So there are powerful individual differences that are driving differential performance and also driving this Pareto distribution. And so it's not merely a random game, although how these people manage to make it into not a random game is beyond me. But there is evidence that our society does hierarchically arrange itself, at least to some degree, by ability and competence. And so then the question is, how do you factor that into the equation when you're thinking about practical, let's call them income. I don't think it's so much income redistribution is that it's an attempt by society to stop too many people from stacking up at 0 and therefore logically turning to violence and that sort of thing as an alternative.
Well, as well as an attempt to just improve the level of justice in society. The idea, you know, I mean, especially if there's a strong element of randomness and who ends up where, then there's something unjust about large numbers being stuck down at the 0. But, you know, you say, how is it possible to redistribute? But countries vary in the extent to which they do this. They vary in the extent to which they tax inheritance. They vary in the extent to which they tax large incomes. They vary in the extent to which they provide education and health care, try and provide it relatively universally, try and make opportunity relatively universal. They vary in these things. And, you know, some of the happiest countries in the world, and I think the most productive countries in the world, the Nordic countries, Japan, have been relatively equitable because they rig this game more than some other countries, if you like. So you say that what stacks up at the top tend to be the most competent and creative people, and implying that to some degree we have a meritocracy. And to some degree we do have a meritocracy. But the four Walmart heirs have as much wealth as the 100 million poorest Americans put together. And they did nothing to earn it. You could say, well, they're high quality people because they got half their genes from Sam Walton and he did something to earn it. That seems like a pretty weak argument for why they should control that much wealth. If inheritance were more severely taxed in order to provide public goods for everybody, would the society be worse off? Would flattening out that curve of accomplishment actually reduce productivity? I think there's some evidence. I wish I could pull it to the forefront of my mind about the utility of distributing grant money more or less equitably in certain sciences, and the amount of science you get for your buck is better when you give lots and lots of people relatively small grants than when you give a small number of people relatively large grants.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because I've worked in the grant system in the U.S. and in Canada, and the grant system in the U.S. is more of the give a few people a huge amount of money for variety, and in Canada it's distributed more equitably. And I must say that I vastly prefer the Canadian system. Now,
I agree with you, and I think the Canadian system has been moving regrettably in the direction of the American. I mean, it partly depends on the field of science, of course. If you need a bloody Hadron Collider, then you need millions and millions of dollars. If you're a psychologist like you or me, things seem to work better in many ways when you fund a higher proportion of grants with a lower variance in the amount awarded. When I first came to McMaster, there was exactly, oh no, I shouldn't say when I first came, let's say the late 80s and early 90s, essentially everybody in the department had a research grant from either NSERC, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, or SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, usually the former in our particular department. Everybody in the department had an active research lab. Everybody created the opportunity for 2 or 3 students to do a bachelor's thesis in their lab each year. Then when things get more variable and people who are being productive, who are getting out a scientific paper or two, doing decent work, making a contribution to knowledge, when they start being denied these grants, when you refuse 2 or 3 times in the competition and say, well, the hell with it, I mean, I've got tenure, I've got a good pension lined up, I think I'll become a real estate speculator. The opportunities for the dissemination of research opportunity to a larger number of students shrink. I think it's been a disaster in certain areas. And an area where I was raised, animal behavior studies, if you just look at either the number of papers in top-ranked journals by country, according to how they allocate their funds or how much money is allocated to it, the money allocated to it is a less strong predictor than you'd expect, and the equitability is a stronger predictor. Sweden and Canada used to, last time I looked, both rank far above the United States in numbers of papers per capita getting into top quality research journals in animal behavior. Okay, it's one little anecdote in a way, but I would be very surprised if there isn't some generality to this phenomenon.
Well, I wonder, though, to play devil's advocate, the thing about distributing research funds more equitably is that you are distributing them among a population that's already been extraordinarily highly selected for capability.
True.
And so it seems counterproductive because it's, for all the flaws of the university system, which are manifold, it is still extraordinarily difficult to become a professor. It's a multi-tiered selection system. And so the people who do become professors are on average very intelligent and on average very hardworking. And we know that because we know what the predictors are of success in academia, and it's intelligence and conscientiousness, unsurprisingly, although creativity seems to play almost zero role.
Really?
But that's partly because, science is an algorithmic game, right? And just beetling away at it busily is a very, very powerful mechanism. So I'm not the least bit cynical about that. I mean, the reason that science works is because in some sense, it has the aspect of factory production. It can be distributed. Anyone can learn to do it. And you get a long ways by nibbling at the edges. You know, it's
Yep. Yep.
continual slow progress when millions of people are doing it is progress that's plenty rapid. So, okay, so there are definitely situations in which denying people resources seems to be completely counterproductive, and that would be one of them. So now the other question though is, I would say, and also that's the thing, there's also an effective means of funneling resources to, let's say, a wide range of professors. It
Yes.
actually works. The problem, one of the problems with general income redistribution is, as far as I can tell, is that we don't really know how to do it very well. And one of the, I mean, look, here's an example. You can tell me what you think about this. So I used to live in northern Alberta when the sporadic oil booms were going on. And my observation was that if you wanted to make money in Alberta when an oil boom was going on, you didn't go out and work on the rigs. Although if you did that, you could make a tremendous amount of money. Now, it was all young men who did that, pretty much, say, between the ages of 16 and 25, something like that. And they were making fantastic amounts of money. But they, almost all of them came out of it with nothing to show for it, because they would work for 2 weeks and then go into town and just have a blowout party for 4 days and spend everything they got and buy expensive cars and wreck them and so forth. So it was reckless behavior that I think was akin, in some sense, to the steep dominance hierarchy violence and that sort of thing, that for status seeking that you're describing. The people who really made money were the bartenders, right? Because they absorbed all the excess profits, and actually generally speaking, or comparatively speaking, were able to utilize the money properly. Now, the point I'm making is that an oil boom is a very effective way of distributing wealth down the economic ladder, but it didn't necessarily seem to me to be a very effective one, because because the money flowed back up to the top 1% damn near as fast as you could shovel it downwards. And that's the thing about that damn Pareto distribution, is that it seems there are people, there's a group, there's a scientific subfield called econophysicists, and they actually modeled the distribution of money in an economy using the same equations that modeled the distribution of a gas into a vacuum. So there's something that's natural law like about this. The economists call it the Matthew principle, right? To those who have everything, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. And I don't think that we've done a good job of grappling with the actual complexity of this. And we tend to split up into politically opposed, what would you call, camps, and argue about the solution to inequality. And the left-wing solution is something like, distribute the money, take it from the rich, especially the undeserving rich, if you can identify them, and give it to the poor. And the conservatives say, well, no, the poor should bootstrap themselves up and maybe be provided with more opportunity, and that might equalize things. But it isn't clear to me that we're actually grappling with the magnitude of the problem.
No, it isn't clear to me either. But what you say about equalizing opportunity, for example, is in a sense distributing the resources, because one way you equalize opportunity is by having universal high quality health care that's paid for by some sort of government revenue, some taxes picked up somewhere. Free education and universal access to education is certainly another, and it's another way that in effect you create a more egalitarian society. So I mean, there are certain domains, certainly education and healthcare, maybe some others that are not springing to mind. Well, I suppose the improvement of various sorts of infrastructure that make it easier to get from point A to point B.
Yeah, so that's
publicly subsidized trends, things like that can certainly be contributors as well. Now that's equalizing in its own right. You're not taking it from anybody and giving it specifically to anybody else. Then there's things like a guaranteed minimum income. And at first it sounds like a crazy idea, the idea that, you should just, we should take government accrued resources, which come from some sort of taxation, and we should just make sure everybody has $15,000 a year to start, or something like that. It sounds kind of wacky, because the standard argument against it from the right has been that it will undermine incentives and nobody will produce bugger all if we could all be welfare queens.
Right.
But we don't want to be welfare queens mostly, and where this stuff has been tried, my understanding is that it's been surprisingly successful. That there was an experiment in Manitoba where a minimum income was tried for a while. Where? And gosh,
Yeah, I
it's not
remember that. And I
not
know, I
back
think
before.
Finland is
By
about to try it.
Finland's about to try it. Manitoba has tried it. It was an NDP government, I think, which then was replaced by a conservative or nominally liberal government. Then sort of canned the results, but the results came to light later and showed that, for example, the number of people who chose not to work did not go up under this, and that it had various beneficial effects. I think it remains to be seen, but I think even the idea of putting money in the hands of everybody from the great collective wealth that has accumulated could be socially beneficial, could be economically beneficial, could be environmentally beneficial.
See, I wonder.
And that certainly in the domains like education and healthcare, that's in effect a kind of redistribution
Right.
that seems easy to effectuate. I mean, not easy to effectuate in terms of convincing people politically or overcoming the propaganda against it, but
Yeah,
we know
well,
how.
a whole bunch of our wealth is embodied in the infrastructure.
Yes.
So I really noticed this, for example, when I lived in Montreal, because Montreal is a great city. And one of the things that distinguishes Montreal from most cities that I've lived in, especially Western cities, is that people live in the city. They don't live in their houses.
Yes.
And the fact that the city is extraordinarily livable, so you can walk everywhere, there's always something to do that's exciting, there's a tremendously active street life, means that there's access to infrastructure and social capital related wealth just distributed everywhere. And that's a lovely thing. So, Kaz, I'm kind of looking for solutions to the Pareto distribution problem that conservatives and liberals alike could agree upon. And so some of those you outlined: improve the infrastructure of our society, because those are public goods that benefit everyone, that also improve productivity. There seems to be no downside to that at all. Also raises employment. Improve the quality of education right from day one, which is something that I think we do a very bad job of. And then the issue with healthcare, it's my understanding that the Canadian healthcare system, and it has flaws, because it's of course dealing with an impossible problem, still uses much less of its capital on maintaining itself and, for example, having to maintain an infrastructure that collects money. I know that the hospitals in the US spend some substantial proportion of the revenue, I can't remember precisely, but it's between 17 and 30%, if I remember correctly, just gathering the money for their services, which seems to be a rather counterproductive use of the resources.
And I wonder how much is spent on billboards advertising their hospitals, too. If you drive the interstate highways of the U.S., it's astonishing how much information about, come to such and such, where we have the best cancer doctors, etc.
And it isn't, and Americans pay a lot for their health care.
They do indeed. They do indeed. I spent 3 years there recently, and we paid a lot for healthcare coverage that turned out not, in fact, to be all that thorough a coverage.
Right. Well, and when I lived in the States too, and I had decent coverage, I was teaching in Boston there. I had a pretty good program, but it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was manifestly different from my Canadian experience, which has been mixed. But of course, it is very important to note that making people healthy is impossible, because everybody gets sick and ages and dies. And so it's an impossible task. And it also indicates to me that that's perhaps one of the reasons why it doesn't fit so nicely into a free market model, because the free market assumes that there's not infinite demand for something, and there is actually near infinite demand for healthcare, especially when you're dying.
There's that, and there's also just, it's an impossible problem because of an aging population. It's an impossible problem because, governments have, one of the determinants of the costs of the healthcare system is how many MDs you've got out there billing it. And governments have a tendency to want to respond to this by restricting the number of new medics. so as to restrict the number of people billing. But this is not much of a solution when you have large numbers of people trying to find a family doctor unsuccessfully.
Okay, so there is some meritocratic structure to our society insofar as IQ, conscientiousness, and openness predict long-term life success. And that's a good thing because that's an indicator of health in a society. I would say it's if your society is set up to allow people who are intelligent and conscientious nearer the pinnacles of power structures, that's a good thing for everyone. Now, you could still have an argument about how steep that gradient should be. But then, with regards to the guaranteed annual income issue, I'm also concerned that the importance of individual differences there are not being considered. So, for example, I don't know what people who are extremely low in conscientiousness would do with an annual income, because they're not inclined to work, and it isn't obvious to me that providing them with an easy way out is the answer, because providing unconscientious people with an easy way out seems to be actually quite counterproductive. And conscientiousness is it's a decent predictor of long-term success. And we also don't know to what degree necessity is a motivator,
I'm out for
which
the
is, of
time
course, the
being.
conservative argument. So, and we also don't know how homogeneous and small a society has to be before income redistribution programs will actually be successful.
Okay.
It seems easier to implement them in